I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning of this video series about kidnapping, by the way, check out the relevant playlist, we talked about how we kidnap people. That's what it'll be called. As I said, I mentioned there would be one case. At least, I think I mentioned it. When the kidnapped person eventually becomes not exactly, well, becomes a criminal themselves, you could say. So today, that's exactly the case. Interesting. On February 4th, 1974, a group of armed men and women broke into an apartment in Berkeley, California. They grabbed a 19-year-old student, Patti Hearst, shoved her into the trunk, and drove away. You see, that daring kidnapping marked the beginning of a story where the lines between victims and accomplices became so blurred that they remain the subject of debate and speculation to this day. Patti was kidnapped by a left-wing radical terrorist group that calls itself the Symbionese Liberation Army. The group was known as the Symbionese Liberation Army. Symbionese Liberation Army? Despite the grand name, the group actually consisted of only a few people. It was led by a man named Donald DeFries. The Symbionese Liberation Army fought for social justice against inequality and racial discrimination. But the methods of that struggle were criminal and included armed attacks, robberies, and of course, violence. At the time of Patti Hearst's kidnapping, the Symbionese Liberation Army was already responsible for an attack on Oakland school administration employees in which one of them was killed and another was seriously wounded by bullets with cyanide-tipped heads. In addition, during the attack on Hearst's apartment, the group also brutally beat the girl's fiancé, Stephen Weed. The Symbionese Liberation Army did not accidentally choose Patti as their hostage. They knew very well that this daring crime would attract the attention of all of America. Hearst was born into a wealthy, influential family. Her grandfather was newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. The criminal's calculation turned out to be quite simple. The kidnapping of the heiress to a multi-million-dollar business would definitely make national headlines and make the Symbionese Liberation Army an incredibly famous organization. 3 days after Patti's kidnapping, a message from the Symbionese Liberation Army was received at a local radio station in Berkeley. It was a sort of statement in which the terrorist organization made an announcement. They issued an arrest warrant for Patricia Campbell Hearst, signed by the Revolutionary People's Tribunal, and declared her a prisoner of war. At the same time, the group promised to release the girl if their conditions were met. They promised to announce the conditions themselves, but a little later. For now, the kidnappers urged Hearst's parents not to cooperate with the police if they wanted their daughter to stay alive and, of course, unharmed. In the following messages, which arrived on February 12 and 14, the Symbionese Liberation Army finally put forward their demands to release previously imprisoned members of the group, Joseph Ramiro and Russell Little. But the state authorities refused to comply with the ultimatum. Then the organization began to demand that the Hearst family distribute food worth $70 to every poor resident of California. After calculations, it became clear that at least $400 million would need to be raised for this operation. Upon learning about this, Patricia's father immediately donated $2 million to create a food distribution program called People in Need. Huge crowds gathered around the food distribution points, which eventually led to riots, injuries, and arrests. After partially meeting the terrorists' demand, law enforcement thought they could now negotiate for Patti's release. At the same time, the Symbionese Liberation Army began demanding an additional $4 million, which caused the dialogue between the group and the authorities to, let's say, come to a halt. After 59 days in captivity, in April 1974, the Symbionese Liberation Army suddenly broke the silence and released an audio recording in which Patti Hearst declared that she had voluntarily decided to join the terrorist group and fight for people's rights together with them. The girl said that she had a choice, either to return home or to become part of the Symbionese Liberation Army. She picked the second option. From now on, Patti asked to be called Tanya in honor of the friend of the Cuban revolutionary leader Che Guevara. The Symbionese Liberation Army soon released a photo of Patti Hearst standing in front of a flag with a seven-headed cobra. This is the group's emblem. The girl is holding a machine gun. On April 15, 1974, members of the Symbionese Liberation Army robbed a local bank branch in San Francisco. Surveillance cameras captured Patti Hearst among the criminals, holding a weapon in her hands. Later, witnesses told the police that during the crime, the girl called herself Tanya and threatened the hostages, so it looked very convincing that she was really part of that group. That day, the Symbionese Liberation Army members succeeded in their plan. Their haul amounted to $10,500. However, the attack claimed the life of one person. Another person was seriously hurt by the gang's actions. Eventually, the criminals managed to leave the scene before the police arrived. Since Patti took part in the robbery, law enforcement was convinced that the girl had joined the Symbionese Liberation Army. This was serious. Soon wanted posters for her were put up all over the United States. Authorities faced questions from the media and public about whether Patti was a victim, brainwashed by the Symbionese Liberation Army and forced to join the attack. Or did she willingly embrace her kidnapper's radical ideology? Ms. Hearst later provided the answer herself, who admitted her involvement in the robbery and also mocked the media's version that she was allegedly forced into the crime. About a month after the robbery, Patti and two other Symbionese Liberation Army members, the couple William and Amy Harris, committed a new crime. This happened in one of the sporting goods stores. The manager noticed William trying to steal something and tried to stop him. At that moment, Patti waited for the couple in the van by the store entrance. When she saw the manager point a gun at her partner William, she took out her own weapon and started shooting at the store window. This really scared the manager. The man hid and the Harris couple was able to escape. And it seemed like nothing too serious happened in the context of the whole story, but you see, this particular crime had serious consequences for the entire group. After the incident, police found the abandoned van Hearst, and the Harrises used to flee the crime scene. Inside the car, the cops found a parking ticket for a private garage, which allowed them to determine the address of the residence where the Symbionese Liberation Army members were hiding. On May 17, 1974, the police surrounded the safe house of the criminal organization. But when the law enforcement officers tried to enter the residence, the Symbionese Liberation Army members immediately opened fire. So a shootout began, which lasted for about 2 hours. The police used tear gas, which later started the fire in the house. When the fire was put out, it turned out that there were 6 Symbionese Liberation Army militants inside. Among them was the leader of the group, Donald DeFries. And you see, everyone who was inside died. Some shot themselves, not wanting to surrender to the police, others burned in the fire. At first, the police thought that Patti Hearst was also among the dead. But when the bodies were identified, it became clear the girl was still alive. At the time of the fire, she and the Harris couple were in another part of Los Angeles. They saw the news on television and, realizing that their leader and comrades were dead, decided to flee immediately. While on the run, the Harrises and Patti resumed the activities of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Patti herself took part in several more crimes. She once witnessed 2 cars and their owners being kidnapped. Later in court, one of the hostages would say that Ms. Hearst treated him very kindly and kept asking if he was okay. In addition, the girl helped the group make homemade explosive devices, which were used in 2 attacks on the police in August 1975. She also took part in another robbery of one of the banks in California. Patti sat behind the van's wheel, waiting for the rest of the gang. At the same time, Emily Harris shot one of the hostages, a 42-year-old mother of 4. For over a year, Patti Hearst managed to successfully hide from the police. Together with the Harris couple, she constantly changed her place of residence and used fake documents. Because of a series of crimes committed and her unwillingness to surrender after the death of the Symbionese Liberation Army leader, the girl was no longer seen as a victim. In society, there was a growing belief that Hearst was not a hostage at all. She was a full-fledged member of the terrorist group, which she joined voluntarily. As of 1975, Patti Hearst was already on the FBI's most wanted list. She was considered dangerous, armed, and capable of resisting arrest. And it was at this time that law enforcement finally tracked her down. They managed to do this after FBI agents began surveillance of other Symbionese Liberation Army members, hoping they would lead them to Patti and the Harris couple. In fact, that's exactly what happened in the end. On September 18, 1975, Hearst was arrested in an apartment in San Francisco. In the first days after her detention, the girl still remained loyal to the Symbionese Liberation Army group. However, she changed her position quite soon. Ms. Patti admitted that she fell under the influence of her kidnappers. She claimed that she was just a victim of circumstances. She talked about the horrors she had to endure after being kidnapped and during her captivity. According to Hearst, the Symbionese Liberation Army kept her in a small closet with her eyes blindfolded for weeks. Mr. DeFriz, the group leader, often threatened Patti with violence. In addition, the girl claimed that she was subjected to psychological and physical pressure, was repeatedly raped by different members of the gang, and felt so isolated that she eventually lost hope of any rescue. Also, according to her, the gang members constantly imposed their radical beliefs, forced her to participate in political discussions, and insisted that Patti read political treatises written by the Symbionese Liberation Army. A few weeks into captivity, the group's leader told Hearst the military council would soon decide her fate. Next is a quote.
Frizz told me that they were considering whether to kill me or give me the opportunity to join them. He emphasized that I should see this as a good opportunity. Then he came later and told me that I could either go home or stay with them. But I didn't believe him.
Patti also mentioned that she was afraid of the group members and understood that no one would just let her go. So she decided to adapt to the situation and agreed to join the Symbionese Liberation Army. Then the girl underwent daily training sessions where they explained the group's ideology and taught her how to use weapons. On February 4, 1976, the trial of Patti Hearst began, almost 2 years after her abduction. The defense was based on the argument that the girl acted under psychological coercion and in fact became a victim of the so-called Stockholm Syndrome. The lawyers argued that after her long captivity, Symbionese Liberation Army members had brainwashed her into believing she was loyal to the group. Psychiatrists who examined Hearst after her arrest confirmed that she was in a state of severe stress, exhaustion, and emotional depression. She experienced sleep problems, anxiety, and general fatigue. All of this was a result of the trauma she had gone through. However, later on, her lawyers restricted further communication between the defendant and the psychiatrists. They were afraid that their findings could be used by the prosecution. The prosecution was still able to criticize the defense's version. Numerous actions and statements by Patsy after the first bank robbery indicated that she was acting fully consciously, without coercion. The prosecution stressed that the law does not recognize awakening. It does not recognize it as grounds for exemption from responsibility. The judge clearly told the jury that the defendant can only be acquitted if, at the time of the crime, she was under an immediate threat to her own life. The prosecution also stressed that the case's circumstances contradict the defense's theory. On the day of the arrest, a necklace was found at Sumashka Patsy's place, a gift from William Cujo Bulf, one of the Symbionese Liberation Army members, whom the woman called her rapist. It was odd that she kept a gift from her tormentor. In addition, revolutionary books and propaganda materials of the group were found in the apartment where Hearst was hiding. The judge's decision to allow the use of Hearst's statements and audio recordings made during her captivity as evidence further weakened the defense's position. The jury played an audio recording in which Patsy says, quote, "The idea of brainwashing is ridiculous." Also, her account of being raped by William Wolf contradicted Patsy's previous statements, in which she called him the gentlest and most beautiful man she had ever known. The key moment was the testimony from government expert Joel Fort. He claimed that Hearst had a tendency toward radical ideas even before the kidnapping, called her emotionally unstable and immoral, and said that her joining the Symbionese Liberation Army was a manifestation of self-hatred rather than the result of psychological pressure. In the end, the court found that Patsy's own testimony was unconvincing, and after 12 hours of deliberation, the jury found her guilty of armed robbery and using a firearm during the commission of a crime. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison, but later this sentence was reduced to 7 years. After 22 months in 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence, replacing the remainder of her term with time served. And then Patsy Vizhnak was released. On January 20, 2001, on the last day of his presidency, Bill Clinton granted a full pardon to Patricia Campbell Hearst, legally nullifying her conviction. After her release, she started acting in films. She married Bernard Shaw, her former bodyguard, and never appeared in criminal reports again. Despite this, the question of whether Patti Hearst was a victim of circumstance or consciously joined the terrorists remains a subject of debate. I think only she herself knows the real answer. Well, I think the same, Sashko. Sorry for that stupid joke. Well, dear, I don't know. Of course, I think that, she is both a victim and at the same time not a victim. That's how it is. A victim of circumstances. Let's put it that way. Well, that's my opinion. Although, on the other hand, there is quite a lot of evidence, really, that she truly embraced those ideas and wasn't just trying to assimilate, let's say, in that situation. Who really knows what she's actually like? You know as much as I do, so we can talk about it in the comments. That's all for today. Videos are released daily, so check the channel yesterday, today, or tomorrow. Whichever day in space and time you exist, that's the day you should visit the channel. I'll be endlessly glad to see you. That's it for now. See you tomorrow.